I need help over here. Someone call 911. Does anyone know CPR?
Breathe, kid. Come on. 1, 2, 3. The man knelt on the sand, his hands placed precisely on the child's chest. Elbows locked. The compressions were steady and decisive. Seawater still dripped from his shirt onto the hot sand. His voice was low, urgent but not panicked, as if everything else around him had vanished. 1, 2, 3. The child lay motionless. Pale skin. Lips beginning to turn blue. Each time the chest moved, it wasn't because the child was breathing, but because someone was forcing life back. Then a voice interrupted. "Sir, what's going on here?" The man didn't lift his head. His hands didn't stop. "I'm a trauma surgeon," he said without pausing. "He's not breathing. I need to continue." There was a brief silence. Very brief. "You don't look like a doctor," the voice replied. "Step back." The countdown paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed. 1, 2, 3. "If I stop," the man said, his breath coming in short gasps, "he could die." Those words would later be broadcast on television, in courtrooms, in law and medical classes. But at that moment, they had no effect. "Stand up, right now." It was Saturday afternoon, the 12th of July 2023. Around 2:21 p.m. at Benton Harbor Beach, and the officer who had just given the order had absolute authority at the scene. He stood straight, hands near his waist, a chest camera recording everything. Before him was a drowning child. Beside him was a man trying to keep the child alive with each breath. "I'm a trauma surgeon," the man repeated. "Please, let me finish." The officer took another step. I said, "Stand up." In that moment, no one screamed. No one was able to stop him. Only the steady sound of the waves behind them, and the eyes of those around them began to realize that something was going terribly wrong, because what was about to happen was not an accident. It was a choice. The police officer standing before them was Darren Colser, 43 years old, 17 years on the job. A man described by colleagues as always having tight control over the scene. In official records, Colser wasn't a troublemaker. No major disciplinary actions, no complaints serious enough to hang his badge on the investigation desk. Everything seemed clean, but that was just the surface. In internal emails, Colser was described as someone so confident he wouldn't tolerate correction. Decisive, tough, believing that anyone who hesitated was weak. Believing that only one person could make the decision at the scene, and that person was always him. Complaints from local residents, especially black families, had surfaced. Unnecessary car stops, voices saying they were yelled at, suspected, treated as threats, all were labeled misunderstanding, then closed. Colser was used to not being questioned. His patrol SUV pulled onto the sandy path leading to the beach, with its lights still flashing. His chest-mounted camera was already on before he opened the door. He stepped out, his gaze sweeping quickly across the crowd, then settling on the man kneeling in the sand. A child lay motionless near the water's edge. A man was performing chest compressions. Colser didn't ask how long the child had been in the water. He didn't ask if anyone had called for emergency services. He didn't check the pulse. He didn't bend down. He looked at the man first. "Step away from the kid." His voice held no curiosity. It was a command. The man continued. "Sir, I need to keep the compressions going." Colser took 2 more steps, closing the distance. I said, "Step away." At that moment, the man looked up. His face was wet. Sand clung to his forearms. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were intensely focused. "I'm a trauma surgeon," he said. "He's not breathing." His name was Dr. Malachi R. Kessler, 39 years old, an emergency and trauma specialist. In his daily work, he was the one called in when things had already crossed the stabilization line, when there was no time for debate, when only action could save lives. But at this moment, his expertise wasn't the first thing that caught his attention. Colser glanced down at the child for a fleeting moment, then back at Kessler. "I don't know who you are," he said. "Get your hands off him, now." A woman in the crowd yelled. He pulled him out of the water. He's doing CPR. Coulser didn't turn. He didn't answer. He didn't ask any further questions. His gaze remained fixed on Kessler. "You don't look like a doctor," he said. "Move." And in that moment, amidst the crowded beach, amidst a child lying motionless, a stark truth emerged. Here, power was more important than expertise, and the one who held power was about to use it. Kessler shook his head. Not forceful, not challenging, just a reflex of someone who knew very well what would happen if he stopped. "If I stop," he said, his voice hoarse, "he could die." Around them, the crowd began to murmur. Some covered their mouths, some took a step forward, then stepped back. All eyes were on the two men standing on opposite sides, one representing life, the other power. Coulser didn't respond. He reached for his waistband. "Turn around," he said. "What?" Kessler looked up, his hand still on the child's chest. "Sir, listen to me." Coulser stepped forward and grabbed his wrist. "Turn around. Now." That grip pulled Kessler up from his kneeling position. At that very moment, the pounding stopped. The counting ceased. The forced chest movements had stopped. The child lay still, completely still. "Why are you arresting him?" someone shouted. "He's a doctor. Do you even know CPR?" Voices overlapped, chaotic, panicked. Coulser yelled louder than anyone else. "Everyone back up. Scene's not secure." He turned, pushed Kessler to his feet, and pulled his arms behind his back. Kessler turned his head to look at the child. "Please," he said, "let me finish. Please." There was no answer. The sound of handcuffs echoed dryly, coldly, a sound that didn't belong on the beach, didn't belong to life. "You should have waited for professionals," Coulser said. In the distance, the ambulance siren blared. Still far away. Still not close enough. Coulser stood between Kessler and the child, as if his very presence were the final barrier. He didn't turn to chest compressions. He didn't tell anyone else to continue. He did nothing. A man in the crowd stepped forward. "Officer, that kid doesn't have a pulse." "Back up," Coulser said, pointing straight ahead. Kessler jerked in his handcuffs. "I told you who I am," he said, his voice breaking. "You're killing him." Coulser didn't answer. He didn't look. He didn't react. Just minutes later, an ambulance sped up, sand flying up behind the wheels. Paramedics jumped out, carrying equipment, first aid kits, hoping to be late. They worked quickly, without much talk. Then one of them slowed down. A glance exchanged, a very slight shake of the head, and as Kessler sat on the back of the patrol car, his hands still cuffed, his head bowed, he knew even before he heard the confirmation that the moment his hands were pulled away from the child's chest was the moment it all ended. The female paramedic was the first to stop. She slowly removed her gloves, as if trying to prolong the final few seconds before uttering the inevitable. Her gaze swept across the child's face, then rose to her colleague, a barely perceptible shake of the head. "Time of death," she whispered. The words didn't sound like a declaration. They fell into the sand, heavy, impossible to retrieve. Some in the crowd wept, some stood motionless, some turned away, unable to bear the sight of the child lying motionless before them. Dr. Malachi Kessler sat on the back of the patrol car, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He bowed his head, staring into the sand. His breathing was shallow and rapid, as if he himself had just been pulled from the water. The police officer standing nearby crossed his arms. He didn't look at the child. "Why is he restrained?" the paramedic asked, her voice calm but firm. "He was interfering," the officer replied. "Interfering how?" "He wouldn't follow commands." She paused. "He was doing CPR," she said. The officer's jaw tightened. "That's not what I saw." The paramedic looked up at him, this time without concealing her disbelief. "How long was CPR stopped?" There was no immediate answer. She didn't wait. "Uncuff him." There was a very brief moment, long enough for the camera to capture, when the officer stood still. His gaze swept across the crowd, over the raised telephones, over the small figure lying on the sand. Then he bent down and unlocked the handcuffs. Kessler rose slowly, rubbing his reddened wrists. His eyes never left the child. "He was cyanotic when I pulled him out. he said immediately, as if afraid that a second's delay would cause the truth to slip away. No pulse. I started compressions within 30 seconds. I didn't stop until I was forced to. The paramedic turned to the police officer. Did he identify himself? He said a lot of things, the officer replied. I said I was a trauma surgeon, Kessler said, his voice trembling. I told you. She nodded slightly. That makes sense. The officer turned away, his voice colder. I don't need medical opinions right now. The paramedic didn't argue. She turned back to the child, checking him one more time as if repetition could change the result. It didn't change. And it was on that beach, amidst the sand, the waves, and the eyes that were gradually understanding what had just happened, that the story officially began to crumble. The commotion in the crowd suddenly parted, creating a path. A woman rushed out from the parking lot. She ran, then slowed, then stopped abruptly when she saw the small pair of shoes near the water's edge. That's my son, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't cry out, just loud enough for everyone to hear and fall silent. Her name was Hollis Rowe. Right behind her was Grant Rowe, her husband. He said nothing. His hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The female paramedic stepped forward, removing her helmet. I'm so sorry, she said. Hollis looked at her, his eyes filled with bewilderment. What do you mean? The paramedic didn't flinch. We did everything we could. Hollis shook her head. Slowly, disbelievingly. No, you didn't. She turned and looked around, her eyes searching through the chaotic crowd. Who was helping him before you got here? No one needed to answer aloud. Several hands simultaneously pointed toward Dr. Malachi Kessler. That man, a voice said loudly. He was doing CPR. Hollis turned to Kessler. They looked at each other for a moment, nakedly, without distance, without superfluous words. Did you stop? She asked. Kessler shook his head immediately. No. I was told to. Grant stepped forward. Told by whom? No one spoke a name, but all eyes were on the same person. Hollis turned to the police officer. You stopped him, she said. You stopped him. The officer took half a step forward. Ma'am, this isn't the time. Hollis interrupted. My son is dead, she said, her voice low, each word falling into the void. Talk now. The officer lowered his voice. We had to secure the scene. Grant looked straight at him. From what? There was no answer. No explanation was sufficient to fill the gap between those two questions. Just then, another patrol car stopped. A senior officer stepped out, Sergeant Tommy Wansky. He looked around, the child on the sand, the parents standing motionless, the phone recording, the doctor still in shock. What happened? He asked. The officer began to recount. Iwansky raised his hand. Stop. He turned to the female paramedic. What happened? CPR was in progress, she replied. It was stopped. By whom? He asked. She didn't hesitate. By him. She pointed. Iwansky turned to the police officer. Is that true? The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. In that moment, right in the middle of the crowded beach and cameras, no further evidence was needed. Everyone understood. This was no longer a misunderstanding. The scene was gradually being cordoned off. Yellow tape was pulled up on the still wet sand. The crowd was pushed back step by step. The sound of the waves continued steadily in the background, as if unaware of what had just happened. Sergeant Tom Iwansky stood in the middle of the scene, taking a quick look. He didn't say much, only asked short questions. Who arrived first? Who touched the victim? Who gave the orders? The police officer, Darren Coulzer, began presenting his version. An unidentified man. Disobedience. Interference with the scene. Restraining. Familiar words. Smooth. Spoken as if rehearsed. Dr. Malachi Kessler sat down on the sand, his hands covering his head. His breathing was heavy and uneven. In his mind, only one moment repeated itself, the moment his wrist was gripped, and the child's chest stopped moving. He knew exactly what that meant. The paramedics packed up their equipment in silence. No one argued, no one raised their voice, but their gazes toward the police officer were no longer neutral. One of them whispered to a colleague, CPR shouldn't have been stopped. The phones remained aloft. No one asked them to be turned off. A young man standing nearby spoke softly, but clearly enough for the microphone to pick up. He saved him from the water. I saw it. Colzer turned around. Sir, step back. That voice, the same tone, the same authority, but this time it was no longer as effective, because the truth had begun to spread beyond the beach. That same night, the body cam footage was ordered to be preserved. Not by the press, but by those within the system who understood that if this video disappeared, things would be far worse. The initial report was drafted quickly. Officers responded to a medical emergency. Scene control was necessary. No confirmation of medical credentials. There was no mention of CPR being performed. There was no mention of handcuffs. As the sun set over the horizon, Dr. Kessler left the beach alone. No ambulance, no escort, no explanation. At home, he placed his phone face down on the table. No reply to texts. No answering calls. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his hand being pulled away from the child's chest. At the same time, Darren Colzer drove home, alone. He told himself he had done the right thing. He had controlled the scene. He had followed procedures. But as night fell, something he couldn't control began to happen. Short video clips shot from various angles began to appear. A man kneeling in the sand. A child lay motionless. One voice said, "I'm a trauma surgeon." And another voice replied, "I don't care." And from that moment, the story no longer belonged to the police. By dawn the next day, the first video footage had leaked from Benton Harbor. Not long videos, not complete, just fragmented pieces, filmed on mobile phones from various angles. But they had one thing in common, an undeniable fact. A child lay motionless on the sand. A man knelt beside him, performing chest compressions repeatedly. A police officer approached, and the moment the hand was pulled out, the sound was indistinct, but clear enough to hear the words that left many speechless. "I'm a trauma surgeon. I don't care." By noon, local stations were broadcasting. By afternoon, national channels were getting involved. No lengthy commentary was needed. The images told the story themselves. The Benton Harbor Police Department issued a short statement. Officers responded to a medical emergency. The incident is under internal review. No mention of CPR. No mention of handcuffs. There was no mention of a child who died after life-threatening conditions were interrupted. The reaction from the medical community was almost immediate. Emergency physicians analyzed every second on television. They talked about the golden minutes, the crucial minutes that determine life and death. They talked about CPR not being allowed to be interrupted unless there was a direct threat. Former medical personnel pointed out something else. The police officer didn't check the pulse. He didn't attempt resuscitation. He didn't ask anyone else to continue. One doctor stated bluntly, "If you stop CPR, you are choosing the outcome." At the hospital, Dr. Malachi Kessler didn't go to work. He sat at the kitchen counter, his hand resting on a cup of cold coffee. His phone rang incessantly, but he didn't touch it. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard the sound of handcuffs, the very moment he knew he had been deprived of his last chance to save a life. That afternoon, Darren Colzer was called to the station. He wasn't assigned to a shift. He wasn't allowed to go to the scene. He was placed on administrative leave. "For doing my job?" he asked. "Yes," the commander replied. That's what leave means. Outside, the pressure continued to mount. Doctors held up signs, "Let us save lives." Activists asked, "Whose life gets interrupted?" And as those questions began to spread, no internal report was enough to cover them up. 2 days after Evan Rowe's death, a platform was erected in front of a law office building in downtown. No large banners, no loudspeakers, only cameras, microphones, and a family with nothing left to hold back but the truth. Hollis Rowe stepped out first. She stood tall. Her shoulders didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. "My son was alive," she said, "when help arrived, and then help was stopped." The crowd in front fell silent. No noise, no murmurs. Grant Rowe stood beside his wife. His hands were clasped together. His jaw was so tight, no one suspected he was suppressing something. This wasn't a mistake, he said. This was a choice. Behind them stood Rashidita Coleman Holt, the civil rights lawyer. In her hands was a thick, marked, categorized, ready-to-use file. "We are filing a civil lawsuit," she said, "on behalf of the Rowe family and Dr. Malachi Kessler." She paused. $28.7 million. Wrongful death. False arrest. Civil rights violations. A reporter raised their hand. Was race a factor? Coleman Holt didn't flinch. The evidence speaks for itself. She didn't need to name names. She didn't need to label anyone. The videos did that for her. Elsewhere in the city, Darren Colser sat in his living room, remote control in hand. He turned off the TV mid-session. No more watching, no more listening. His phone vibrated. A message from a colleague, from acquaintances, from people who no longer wanted to associate their names with him. A message appeared on the screen. "You should have let him keep going." Colser didn't reply. At police headquarters, the filing cabinets were reopened. Old reports were pulled out of the cupboards. Complaints that had been dismissed were reread this time, with a different eye. What had once been called misunderstandings was now beginning to take shape. And as the city prepared for a protracted legal battle, one thing was clear. This was no longer about a wrong decision. It was about a system that had allowed that decision to happen. When the lawsuit was filed, things shifted to a different pace. No longer a reaction. No longer crisis management. Instead, a search of the past. The Department of Home Affairs began reopening Darren Colser's file, not to find one major mistake, but to see how many small mistakes had been overlooked. Unnecessary car stops. Reports describing uncooperative behavior. Complaints from black residents, saying they were suspected simply because they existed. Each incident, taken alone, seemed insignificant. But when put together, they began to form a pattern. The city attorney made the familiar argument. The scene was unverified. Medical identities were unclear. Officer safety was the top priority. Those words sounded right until they matched the video. The video shows Colser didn't ask for names, didn't ask for identification, didn't request proof of expertise. The video shows CPR was ongoing continuously until it was forcibly stopped. The video shows Colser didn't take over resuscitation, didn't delegate tasks to others, didn't treat the child as the center of the scene at all. Experts were called in to analyze the situation. The law enforcement trainer stated clearly, "Scene control never includes stopping life-saving medical care." The emergency room doctor stated bluntly, "Every second of CPR interruption reduces the chances of survival." What was once called a split-second decision is now called by its proper name, a series of wrong choices. Darren Colser was informed he would have to testify under oath. No cameras, no orders, no control, only questions. That evening, he sat alone, looking at the legal file he'd just been given. The words he'd used to write the report, interfering, uncooperative, non-compliant, now turned against him. Elsewhere, Dr. Malachi Kessler met with his lawyer. He brought medical records, certificates, and confirmation letters from the hospital. The lawyer only glanced at them. "We won't need most of this," she said. "The video does the work." Kessler looked down at the table. "I keep thinking," he said slowly. "If I had just ignored him." The lawyer interrupted him. "That's what power does," she said. "It forces compliance." And when those words were spoken, one thing became clear. This case wasn't just asking who was wrong. It was asking who had the authority to give orders and who had to remain silent. The hearing room had no windows. Cold, white, fluorescent light shone down on the long table where Darren Colser sat upright, his hands clasped in front of him. To his left was the city attorney. In front of him was the court clerk, fingers poised on the keyboard. No seatings. No radio. No one to give orders to. Only questions. Officer Colser, Attorney Rashidita Coleman Holt, said calmly, "When you arrived on scene, did you observe the child breathing?" "No." Colser replied. "Did you check for a pulse?" "No." "Did you attempt CPR yourself?" Colser paused. "No." No one interrupted. No one came to the rescue. The silence lasted just long enough for the answers to carry their weight. Coleman Holt looked down at the file, then looked up. "Then why did you stop it?" Coulser adjusted his posture in the chair. "I needed to control the scene." "Control what?" she asked. "The individual interfering." "Who was that individual?" Coulser didn't answer immediately. She leaned forward. "The trauma surgeon?" There was no answer. The city attorney requested a break. The request was noted. The hearing adjourned for 10 minutes. When they returned, the questions continued. "Did Dr. Kessler ever threaten you?" "No." "Did he have a weapon?" "No." "Did anyone on scene pose an immediate danger?" "No." Coleman Holt nodded, took notes, and then asked the final question of the morning. "Officer Coulser, do you agree that uninterrupted CPR can be the difference between life and death?" Coulser swallowed hard. Yes. That answer was unquestionable. It was recorded, and in that very moment, the foundations of defense began to crumble. Outside the hearing room, Dr. Malachi Kessler sat silently. He didn't participate in the debate. He didn't look at the camera. He just waited, as he had waited for the ambulance that day, knowing that every passing second carried an irreversible consequence. By the end of the day, the city attorney requested more time, not to find the truth, but to minimize the damage. And when the hearing room door closed, everyone inside understood. The question was no longer whether something was wrong, but how wrong it was, and who would pay the price. After the hearing, no one in City Hall spoke of image protection anymore. The only question asked, behind closed doors, was, how much damage would there be? The city's lawyers began to change their tone. No more denials. No more emphatically asserting that procedures were followed. Instead, words like exposure, liability, risk management. The legal counsel reviewed the video again and again. Each time they watched, they spoke less. No one argued that CPR had been stopped. No one denied that the child had a chance of survival while Kessler was performing chest compressions. The only question remaining was, who would bear the consequences, and to what extent? Negotiations took place in silence. No press conferences, no press releases. Only numbers were written, erased, and rewritten. 20 million, 25 million, 28. Ultimately, the figure settled at $28.7 million. The city called it a financial decision, not an admission of wrongdoing, not a formal apology. But no one outside the boardroom believed that. When the information leaked out, the reaction wasn't explosive, it was heavy. People weren't surprised. They were simply confirming what they already knew. Dr. Malachi Kessler didn't appear before the press, no exclusive interviews. He returned to the hospital, back to the emergency room, back to saving lives this time, in a space where power wasn't allowed to interfere between heartbeats and hands. Darren Coulser, however, was different. 2 weeks after the settlement was announced, he submitted his resignation. No farewell meeting, no speech, no explanation. The resignation letter stated personal reasons. The badge was placed back on the table. The gun was surrendered. His name disappeared from the duty roster. The next morning, Sergeant Tom Iwanski stood before the unit. "Authority," he said slowly, "doesn't replace judgment, and it never replaces humanity." No one objected. No one took notes, because everyone understood. This wasn't a theoretical lesson. This was the consequence. After the lawsuit concluded, the city of Benton Harbor was forced to change, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. New guidelines were issued. Police were instructed not to interfere with life-saving medical care unless there was a direct and clear threat. Training on potential bias became mandatory. An independent oversight committee was established. These announcements were read aloud in boardrooms, posted on the website, archived in records, but none of them could bring Evan Rowe back. The Rowe family established a small fund in their son's name, a fund focused on water safety and basic first aid education. They didn't invite city representatives to the launch ceremony. They didn't need symbols. They just needed the truth to be remembered. Dr. Malachi Kessler continued working in the trauma department. Colleagues said his hand was still steady, but his shoulders were heavier than before. He no longer went to the beach, no longer knelt on the sand, no longer placed himself where power could cut across the line between life and profession. The video from Benton Harbor Beach still exists. It's shown in law classes, in medical ethics courses, in police academies, not to humiliate, but to remind that power, if unchecked, can kill faster than the accident. That doing the right thing isn't enough if the system doesn't allow you to do it right. And that, sometimes, the most dangerous thing at the scene isn't the chaos, but a person who believes they can't be wrong. A child lost their life. A doctor lost a moment he would carry with him for life. And a decision lasting a few seconds revealed a truth that community had long felt. If this story makes you think, leave a comment below. Not to be angry, but to remember. Because stories like this only truly create change when they are not forgotten. Subscribe to continue following real-life cases, where cameras not only capture images, but also expose what those in power often want to hide.